Jaya Radha Madhava Punya Vihari.
Hare Krishna, welcome to Devotees, back to Books Are the Basis, another interview on the importance of reading Srila Prabhupada's books, organized by the ISKCON Ministry of Education. And today we are very happy and honored to have with us His Grace, Chandrasekhar Prabhu. Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Rupa. Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much for joining us. Chandrasekhar Prabhu serves as the GBC for China, and he has a very interesting, actually, spiritual journey, as we can say. Born in 1970 in Sydney, in Australia, in the age of 8 years, he came in touch with Krishna consciousness via his mother, who became a devotee, and then soon found himself in Vrindavan Gurukul, spent 3 years there, and then later another 9 years at the Mayapur Gurukul, and in this way got a very strong foundation of Krishna consciousness in a very early age. Then after that, again spent time in Australia, and later on the instructions of his spiritual master, His Holiness Tamal Krishna Goswami, went on and started to serve in China, where he lives since 1998. That's right?
Hong Kong, living in Hong Kong, which is also, of course, also part of China. That yes.
In Hong Kong, yes.
Yeah.
So that's over 20 years, and has been serving and helping the devotees there in many, many ways. And since around 10 years, serves as a GBC there, is responsible for this area of the world. And also, I find it interesting, you also did a study on Asian culture and in order to understand the mentality of Chinese. That's right?
Not just Chinese, but Asia generally.
Asia in general, yeah.
Asian area studies.
Yeah.
Which includes a lot of India, of course, also naturally.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being with us. Usually we start with our interview with the question of how did you came in touch with Krishna consciousness, and what was the first book that you received? Of course, in your situation, a bit different, but still, do you remember what was the first book you read? Was it already in Australia at home, or did it start at the Gurukul when you systematically studied?
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, I came to Krishna consciousness through my mother, or because of my mother.
Mm-hmm.
So in my case, it wasn't because of a book; it was because of my mother.
Yes.
And at that age, I was 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
At that age, all I remember about the books were the pictures.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't read any book, when I was 8 years old. I just remember the pictures from the books, really. And then, of course, I remember a couple of children's books, which were available at that time. But otherwise, it wasn't the book itself that directly brought me to Krishna consciousness. And then even when I went to Vrindavan, I guess for the Gurukul there, again, I was only 10, 11 years old. To be honest, I don't remember so much interaction with Srila Prabhupada's books personally. Of course, we had our Shastra classes and such. But I personally don't remember any, my reading them or trying to, learn them and such. That only really began in Mayapur, when I went to Mayapur, as I remember it, in 82. I went there in 1982, mid-82. And then perhaps a year or so after that, then I remember getting to know Srila Prabhupada's books.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at that time, we were taught, we began a Bhakti Shastri, what now is very common and everybody's doing it. We began a Bhakti Shastri course at that time in the Mayapur Gurukul, taught by Atma Tattva Prabhu, Indian origin devotee.
Mm-hmm.
Very learned, very philosophical, very smart, basically, in the
Yeah.
philosophy of Krishna consciousness. So he was teaching us the Bhakti Shastri course. So it was really then, perhaps I would have been 14 or so, 14 or 15, when I began to more deeply enter into and, appreciate Srila Prabhupada's teachings. Prior to that, I don't have such a strong impression, although I would have read, I'm sure I would have read, the books, but given the age and perhaps where my head was at, I wasn't able to absorb that much. But from the time of this Bhakti Shastri course, which went on for 2 or 3 years, it wasn't, the 2 or 3 months, the 3 or 4 month course that happens now. It was a much more involved Bhakti Shastri syllabus. The whole outline was quite different from what is done now. But that's when I really began to enter into Srila Prabhupada's teachings and books in a more serious way and in a way that I could remember also.
Thank you. Do you still remember, I don't know, some specific book or passage in the books which really kind of touched you? Or, and it's also interesting if you joined so young, because at some point still you would have to make a conscious decision. Yes, I want to be a Krishna conscious, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, think about this a little bit.
Well, in my case, I've heard it said that before, that even if you're born or brought up in the movement, at some point you make a conscious choice that, I want to be a devotee. This is something I'm going to do, not just that we were born into it and fine. So I sort of remember doing that quite early on. And as far as I can recall, it happened, I think it happened quite naturally or quite spontaneously. I wasn't, it wasn't circling around in my head, should I or shouldn't I? I didn't feel it happened like that. It just happened in quite a spontaneous, I think, natural sort of way, after I went to Vrindavan and then, of course, Mayapur. But everything about, the process and everything about the Holy Dham and the deities and the chanting, just reinforces that commitment, that, I want to try to be a devotee of Krishna and, engage in his service and so on. So I don't remember a specific time or a specific age, when I made that conscious choice to, serve and try to be a devotee of Krishna. It just seemed to happen in the course of things. As for, books that I remember from that period of my life, I guess it would be the Bhagavad Gita. I guess it would be the Bhagavad Gita because that was the first book that I actually learned, not in the reading sense. Quite often we just read to read, and I'm not sure how much we remember. We just read to read, and it goes in one ear and comes out the other ear. But when you have to learn a book, when we study a book, then, and you write your questions and your answers and you have to review, it's like studying a text, not just reading a text, but actually studying a text. Then it embeds itself more in the consciousness. So, and we spent a good 1.5 or 2 years learning the Bhagavad Gita as part of the Bhakti Shastri course. And because of that, that's probably the book that I remember the most, or the teachings that I remember the most, from that time. And I think another advantage that helps us remember the teachings is teaching. Sometimes we're just passive readers, but we don't necessarily interact with the text so much. We just, read it. But if we interact with the text more, either through writing, answers or taking notes, and then if we have to teach it, then it certainly embeds itself more in the consciousness. We remember more. you might be familiar, Krishna Prema Prabhu. I don't remember the exact statistic, but there's some statistic. If you read, you remember a certain amount. If you read and write, you remember a certain amount. If you read, write, and speak it, then you remember a much higher percentage. So probably it was the Bhagavad Gita, because we spent so much time hearing and then writing questions and answers. And then, as I became a little bit older in the Gurukul, I began to teach the younger kids.
Yeah.
So that really helped to me to remember the Bhagavad Gita. So that's probably the first book that impacted me more than others, simply because I interacted with it much more than the other literatures at that time.
Yeah, I can imagine this study must have been really the foundation of your life, like still many years later. I'm sure you still, whatever knowledge and understanding of Gita must be based on these early days.
Yes, no doubt. It was. No doubt it was, yes.
Maybe just in general, what would you say are the benefits for devotees to read regularly? Why it's important to read on a regularly basis Prabhupada's books?
I guess I think an answer to that, or one answer would be, again, not just the reading, but actually trying to interact, with the text, because, we can all read, but then it doesn't necessarily mean we remember very much. I mean, like chanting, we all chant our 16 rounds, but it really depends on how mechanically or superficially or routinely we're doing it. So I believe the same applies to reading. So I don't think it's just the reading, but it's really how much we try to interact with the text. If we're taking notes or making notes whilst we are reading. But as we often hear in our teachings, we have Vani and Vapu. So reading Srila Prabhupada's books is certainly a way to associate with him. It's a way to associate with him. And as, again, Srila Prabhupada so many times said, if you want to know me, you have to read my books. I'm in my books, and we've heard these statements so many times.
Mm-hmm.
So that's certainly a great advantage. By reading Srila Prabhupada's books, we actually learn to associate with him, or we actually are associating with him, which in and of itself is a great blessing, because most of us didn't get that personal association with him. Even among Prabhupada's disciples, most of them didn't either. Most of them got their association also through reading his books. So the same applies for, future generations of devotees. Most of our association will come from reading his books. That will be our association with him, and of course the other great devotees whose lives or teachings we talk about and read about. So it's the association, it's the sadhu sangha of Srila Prabhupada and the numerous other great devotees whose lives are depicted in the Bhagavatam, for example.
So that association with Prabhupada, of course, which if it takes place on a daily basis, it really helps us to deepen that relationship with him.
Yes, it does. Daily association.
In a previous conversation, you also mentioned about hearing Prabhupada's lectures. And of course, in some way, reading Prabhupada's books is also a form of hearing. But then we have also the lectures that are recorded. And you like to share your realizations on that with us?
Yes. I didn't pay much attention to Prabhupada's lectures for a number of years. We tend to listen to, it's just like kirtans. There's so many kirtans around the ISKCON world now. We tend to listen to everyone else's kirtans except Srila Prabhupada's kirtans. And I think it's similar with lectures. You know, there's so many lectures by so many devotees, with so many topics. I'm guessing that probably, you know, most of the ISKCON world listens to everybody else and listens to Srila Prabhupada's lectures, probably less. That's my guess. It seems to be that way with kirtans. You know, when you go into a temple, you'll hear this famous kirtaniya or that famous kirtaniya, or if you jump into someone's car, you'll hear this kirtaniya or that kirtan. But it's quite rare that you'll hear Srila Prabhupada's kirtan. And I think it's the same for lectures, Prabhupada's recorded lectures. Again, there's no harm listening to other devotees' kirtans or lectures. But anyway, because of that, I made a conscious effort within myself that, you know, I should hear all of Srila Prabhupada's lectures. So I started to do so. And I mean, that's another way of interacting with the text. Actually, it's another way of interacting with his teachings. When we hear, you know, Srila Prabhupada speak about what he writes, we hear him speak about what he writes. You may have seen, you know, in India, some devotee, they produce some kind of a radio and it has a chip in it.
I have one, yes.
Yeah, that's what I use, yeah. And, you know, you can choose you dial in your number and you can choose your lecture, you know, the topic. And so I just started, you know, with Bhagavad Gita and then the Nectar of, I did the 4 books first, the Bhakti Shastri books first. I started with the Bhagavad Gita, the Nectar of Devotion. There's no Nectar of Instruction lectures, but, and Ishopanishad. And again, it's another way of associating with Srila Prabhupada, as you mentioned a little bit earlier. It's basically his books in audio. Essentially, it's his books in audio rather than, you know, reading the written word. We're hearing the spoken word. And yes, it's just a wonderful way to hear Srila Prabhupada's, you know, his mannerisms, his expressions, the terminologies that he uses to express himself, and his conviction, you know, in what he's talking about. So it really, I think it very much complements the reading part of his teachings, along with, you know, the hearing part of his teachings. It strengthens both, particularly because, you know, we hear his, you know, his mannerisms, the intensity in his voice, and, you know, the words that he uses and the phrases that he uses, and so on. So again, it's just a great association, sound, right? Association in sound, which, yeah, it's just very nourishing. It's just very nourishing.
Yeah, that's a very important input in the sense of, while reading and we understand the author better, then that will enhance our reading, right? And of course, we associate with Prabhupada through the books, but when we know more about the person, and certainly listening to his lecture will help us to get a better picture of who Prabhupada was and what his mentality. Yeah.
I mean, something I never knew, which I only discovered when I heard the lectures. You know, the introduction to Bhagavad Gita is based upon lectures.
Mm-hmm.
I never knew that before, probably because I didn't listen to the lectures. But when I began listening, I listened to the Bhagavad Gita first, a series of Bhagavad Gita. The first series of lectures is the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, spoken, and then it was put in written form as the introduction. And I never knew that before until just, you know, a few years ago, which illustrates that we don't always take these things as seriously as we should. You know, after 40 years, finally, I know the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita is actually based upon, you know, a collection of lectures that Srila Prabhupada gave in, you know, in 1966.
Now, being a manager, I'm sure, I mean, as a GPC, you must be quite busy person. And as many devotees are busy, either because of management or because of just their daily activities. How do you manage to find time to read, or what would be your advice to kind of make reading a priority?
I'm not sure it's a good excuse or a good answer, but a lot of my service is sharing or teaching. And because of that, I'm obliged to read.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right answer or, the best answer from a GBC member or someone on that who does that kind of a service, but it's certainly a motivating factor. It's certainly a motivating factor because, a lot of our service, if you've been in Krishna consciousness for some years, naturally you're going to be engaged in teaching also. And because that's a lot of the service, so you end up, or you have to read, you have to prepare yourself to, speak to your audience properly. So in the last number of years, that has been more, I've been doing that more of the Bhagavatam.
Yep.
So I began with, as I mentioned, with Bhagavad Gita, because that's what we start, the 4 books, basically. And then, of course, I've taught those books also. So because of that, you have to read them again and again and again. But in the last number of years, it's been more in the context of the Bhagavatam. Not that I'm teaching Bhakti by Baba, or I'm not doing that, but just teaching or sharing different parts, of the Bhagavatam. And in doing that, you have to prepare, you have to read and so on. And it's always so, enlivening and refreshing. I would like to think if I wasn't teaching, I would still be reading as much. I would like to think, I would be reading as much. But at least for now, this is what obliges me to read regularly. This is what obliges me to read regularly.
Well, after all, we're a preaching mission, so I think it's a good input that, as members of ISKCON, at some point we want to share Krishna consciousness, and then if you want to share, you need to know what you're talking. So that's certainly.
And again, the sharing really helps us to remember it. That's been my experience. I learned more by sharing than just by reading.
Yeah.
I think that's probably why Srila Prabhupada himself always encouraged and pushed devotees to preach, because when we share with others, Krishna reveals more. The books reveal more to us. The books reveal more to us by sharing them with others. And I think I could say, at least in my case, I probably learned more by sharing, in the sense that you have to prepare and then we have to share. And then by sharing, we remember and learn more, and the teachings are revealed. But after all, it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's really, revelation from the Shastra and from the Guru that we understand these things. And by sharing, it's a kind of service to the Guru and the Shastra. And then they reveal more and more to us meanings and insights and so on.
So through the preaching, actually, that the mercy aspect is also coming into the picture.
Yes.
It gives us deeper access to the books and to the scriptures.
Yes. I that's my experience anyway. My part of my realization anyway.
Well, as a GPC member, I'm sure you're aware that this initiative, Books Are the Basis, was started also because there was a concern amongst the GBC members that it seems that our members in ISKCON do not read so often, and we try to encourage devotees to read more often. So what would you say in what way would ISKCON be a different movement if actually every single devotee would read on a daily basis? How would it affect our movement? What would you say?
Well, I guess if we did read daily, the level or the maturity of devotees would, the general community of devotees would increase. General maturity would increase and deepen. As we all know, Srila Prabhupada's very well-known statement, philosophy without religion is dry mental speculation, and religion without philosophy is sentiment, and sometimes becomes fanaticism. So, we have all our religious aspects, going to Mangalati, taking prasadam, participating in festivals, kirtan, we do, this is, you could say, the religious aspect of our practice. But if it's not philosophically very strong from regularly reading Srila Prabhupada's teachings, then it's a little bit emotional, maybe not very deep. And then when things go wrong in our life, then, we have a crisis of faith and we wonder why and what to do and all these sorts of things. So the philosophy, the teachings, Srila Prabhupada's teachings help to solidify our faith. It helps to make us more solid in our practice. So when things do go wrong, which invariably they will, because it's just the nature of things, then we won't be blown in the wind as much as we otherwise probably would. So that would certainly be one result of not just reading, but again, properly reading Srila Prabhupada's books. Our faith would be strengthened. So when things do go wrong, we won't be, blowing back and forth, like a piece of paper, a piece of paper on the road. But we would be more solid in, facing the challenges that we all have to face in life. And even the challenges that we face with each other, because we'll have hopefully a better understanding of the philosophy, which will strengthen our faith, increase our maturity, and just generally make us more solid in Krishna consciousness. And as a consequence, it would help to make ISKCON more solid. If its members are solid, then naturally the society itself will become more solid.
Basically, that Shastriya Shraddha, in Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur speaks in Madhurya Kadambini about this initial faith, which is based on actually Shastra. So that's something which would become more kind of solid and strong. Yeah, that would be wonderful if we all could.
It would. Yeah.
Certainly Prabhupada's vision that his disciples, followers are much more like absorbed in his teachings. Now, you already shared a little bit about, you spoke about your motivation or inspiration for reading, which has to do also with the teaching that you do and your service. Still, some devotees, they face a lot of difficulties when it comes to reading, in a sense of they feel they don't have so much time, or they once they get time, they feel tired, or they have a lack of taste. So what would you advise devotees to overcome these obstacles in reading? Any other practical solutions or tips how to find taste in reading?
I guess it's a similar principle to chanting. We all know we have to chant our 16 rounds, or, if we're not initiated, 8 rounds, or whatever we do. We all know we have to do that. So, we can do it mechanically and just get by, or we can try to do it nicely and then, really feel something. And I think, we all experience, if we chant, good average rounds, it's very different than chanting lazy rounds. It's almost like night and day. I think every devotee has had that experience, at least sometimes. And I believe the same principle applies to reading Srila Prabhupada's books. We can do the mechanical, reading a page a day or 2 pages a day or whatever it might be. And, we might get by, we might go through the mechanics of it, but because we're not getting a taste, it's unlikely we'll be able to, maintain it, for any length of time. But if we as with our chanting, if we make a conscious effort, this is my time with Srila Prabhupada, or this is my time with, Sukadev Goswami or Prahlad Maharaj, if, we're reading if we think of it, try to think of it in that way, this is my time with them. As we say, when we chant our japa, this is our time with Krishna. So when we're reading different parts of the Shastra, depending upon what we're reading, if we can somehow meditate, this is my time with them, whether it's for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, this is my time with them, then it will probably become more fulfilling. And when it's more fulfilling, it's easier to do. If it's more fulfilling, it's easier to do because we feel something, we're not just, reading a bunch of words, but we're actually trying to associate with the persons, whom we're reading about. Then it would be more fulfilling. I mean, there's no magic answer, there's no magic answer in that sense. We just have to, as with our chanting, as with anything that we do, we just have to try to do it mindfully. We have to try to be present. We have to try to do it mindfully. And again, we experience, if we do it that way, the experience is much more fulfilling and we get much more from it personally. As with, if we sit in a kirtan or chant out, it's the same basic principle. Because really it's Shravanam and Kirtanam, whether it's in a kirtan or on our beads or with the book, it's still the same Shravana and Kirtanam. So the same principles apply, for, any one of those activities, to do it mindfully, which will naturally give more nourishment and fulfillment. And then it's something that we look forward to doing.
Yeah, as you mentioned, if it's nourishing us, then we want to do it again, and certainly we will continue with it.
Yes.
But you're saying the key to achieve that kind of stage is to put in some endeavor and do it mindfully with attention, and then because it is full of taste, it naturally should,
Yeah. Give taste. It should give taste. Yeah. It's full of taste, so it should give taste. Yeah, and I guess it's a matter of priorities.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a saying, I don't know where it comes from. It's not a Shastric saying, but there's some saying to the effect that, and it lists a whole bunch of, famous names, Confucius, Mao Zedong, whoever. They all have the same amount of time as all of us. But they manage their time better, so they get more done. Right? It's not a Shastric saying. There's a list of, all sorts of material, famous people who really did a lot in life. And they have the same 24 hours that, the average person has, but they get more done, probably because they manage their time better. So it's, again, a matter of, it's a matter of priority. And there's another saying you may have heard. People overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in 5. So if we think of it in that way, even if we mindfully read, however, 5 or 10 pages or whatever it is a day, after 5 years, that's probably a lot of books. You've probably read quite a lot of books. But again, it's just, what's important in life and how much time we waste. We waste a good amount of time. I mean, I'm speaking to myself. It's not like I'm an ideal example of what I'm talking about. But, we waste a good amount of time. If we arrange our time better and do what we do more mindfully, then naturally we would get much more from our, devotional activities.
Yeah, I think many devotees, if they see there's so many books to be read, like the whole Bhagavatam, 18,000 shlokas, some devotees feel like, oh my God, and I will never do it. And then they just, leave it aside. But as you mentioned, if you actually just daily read something, over the years, you actually can accomplish a lot.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit similar, with the kirtans and the lectures. nowadays there's so many other books people can read.
That's also there, yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, that would be an interesting study or an interesting survey. What other books besides Prabhupada's books have you read? You know, all the Leela books and, you know, all these other sorts. I mean, again, they're all wonderful. They're all Shastra. They're all, you know, from past great devotees. But again, I wonder if that's another reason why devotees don't read Srila Prabhupada's books as much as they should, because, you know, they're delving into all the other Leela books and, you know, other things that are available now, as with lectures and, you know, as with kirtans. That would be something interesting to find out.
But again, as you mentioned, if we understand Srila Prabhupada's position and our relationship to him, then we naturally would want to be in touch with Prabhupada regularly. Yeah. Of course, we also mentioned about, it's not only about reading, it's about deeply realizing this knowledge. And at the end of the day, it's studies about transformation of the heart also. Any thoughts on this? How to ensure that we apply what we read? Because I mean, we receive so much knowledge, spiritual wisdom actually from Prabhupada, previous acharyas. But how to make sure to apply in our daily life? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's our challenge, isn't it? To bring it from here down to here. When we read, it goes up here, but we need to bring it down to the heart, make it from jnana to vijnana. And that's exactly our, I guess that's what distinguishes a realized devotee from a not realized devotee. A not realized devotee or a less realized devotee may have the information, but the level of realization or application is not as much as for the realized devotee or more realized devotee. And again, it's just a matter of trying to be mindful. It's just we're supposed to be conscious of Krishna. We always say that we're supposed to be Krishna conscious, and we've probably heard this statement before. We can be Krishna conscious, we have to be conscious. So when it comes to, you know, the teachings, you know, if we're reading about Prahlad Maharaj or Dhruva Maharaj, I mean, we all face similar challenges, maybe obviously not to that extreme, but we all have challenges in our lives, whether it be amongst devotees or amongst the world or just within ourselves. And when we do, we somehow have to recall what we have read and put it into practice. And again, it's, you know, there's no magic bullet. There's no magic bullet to do that. It's just something that we have to do. It's as you know, we may have heard the statement, you know, someone asked Srila Prabhupada how to be humble. And Srila Prabhupada said, by being humble. It's just, you know, you just have to do it, basically. So we have all these teachings, you know, from the Shastras. We're not the body and so on. You know, so when someone walks past and says, hey, Prabhu, you're a real idiot, how are we going to respond? Are we going to respond thinking, okay, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, it's just my fault? Or are we gonna, you know, become all reactive and who do you think you are, and, you know, etc. So that's our challenge. That's really the process of Krishna consciousness, how to, again, be mindful of the teachings and how to, because we face so many situations. So there's plenty of opportunities to apply the philosophy in our daily life. There's, you know, so many opportunities. And, you know, the question is how much we take advantage of those opportunities, you know, to apply the teachings of Srila Prabhupada's books that we read of. that's a moment to moment challenge. It's and like everything, I think with practice it becomes more and more natural. With practice it becomes more and more natural. When we're not feeling happy, we think of the mantras Masha Sukunteya Sitoshna Sukadukada. we can hopefully recall these statements to help deal with them and to help live the philosophy that we talk so much about. When we talk to others, we can really be confident. This is it. When not the body, happiness and distress comes, we can really be super confident when we talk to others. But when it comes to ourselves, it's not always. We don't always do such a great job of applying it in our own lives. So that's our challenge. That's exactly what we need to do. That's what it means to be a realized devotee, right? That's really what it means. One of the meanings, anyway.
So life in itself is the school.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
chance
especially devotee life. Especially devotee life.
Especially GBC lives.
Yeah.
As a manager, there is always a lot of.
Yeah, you have to learn to be. I mean, as it said, being Krishna conscious is not easy, but not being Krishna conscious is more difficult, actually speaking. So, yeah, putting the philosophy into practice is not always easy, but not doing it is even more stressful. It's even more stressful.
Yeah, I find your message quite inspiring in the sense of that we all will face difficulties and challenges in our life. I mean, we can't avoid it. It will come. If we are kind of prepared with the wisdom that we learned from the Shastra, then we have at least some ways to deal with it.
Yes.
But for that, we need to understand our philosophy. For that, we need to absorb it.
Yes.
But we can also apply it. But that's it's very practical and everyone needs it. Yes.
I think another important element here is performing menial service. And we all know the Tadvidi Pranipatena verse, right, from chapter 4. Inquiring submissively and rendering service.
Mm-hmm.
Because, reading the book, it's more than an intellectual activity. We all know that. It's not just a brain activity, it's a heart activity. And one way we prepare the heart is by service, particularly menial service. So again, it's not just an intellectual effort. How can I apply the teachings to my... That's part of it, of course. But that's not the whole story. By performing menial service, that in and of itself, it's not technically, reading the books, but by performing that menial service, Krishna's humility, right? We develop humility through doing that. And it's the humility that reveals Shastric knowledge. It's really the humility that having the proper mood and attitude and service mood, right? Then the spiritual master, right, reveals the truth. Why? Because of the submissive inquiry and the mood of service. So, as far as imbibing and putting into practice the teachings that we read, it's not just an intellectual effort, but it's part of, our menial service. It also is no less of a necessary factor, whether it's, washing the pots or cleaning the floor or serving prasadam. All of these things have an impact on how much we are able to realize and imbibe and live the teachings that, we talk so much about. Very much based upon service, especially as leaders. There's always the possibility that we do leadership service and we don't do the regular services, that the average devotee might do. And I think that's something we have to be careful about. We have to mind ourselves in that regard, as supposed leaders, that we also should be doing menial services, because it helps us, well, for a start, it helps us to cultivate humility. And it also helps us to the knowledge to reveal itself with, and that's really something I learned from the Gurukul. That's, you're in the house of the Guru. What do? You do a lot of menial service. That's what you do. You're learning the Shastra and you're doing a lot of menial service. That's certainly something that I learned from my years in the Gurukul there. Menial service also. And by Krishna's grace, it's been able to stay with me more or less until now. And that's what helps us understand the teachings also.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I think it's such an important point that it's not just an intellectual exercise, and also, of course, the more knowledge we gain, maybe we become proud of our learning and scholarship. But yeah, to see it as a whole, the whole process of Krishna consciousness, which certainly devotional service implies that this. Yeah. Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think we got a lot of nectar, a lot of gems from your wisdom and life experience. Do you have any concluding words, some final message you'd like to share with us?
What can we do? We can just keep trying. Again, there's no, magic bullet, no magic answer. It's not necessarily going to be easy. But again, if we apply ourselves and try, Krishna will reciprocate. The books will reciprocate. Srila Prabhupada will reciprocate. The teachings will reciprocate, and it will become more and more fulfilling, more and more nourishing, more and more uplifting. More and more uplifting. We just have to want to. I guess we just have to want to and see it as a priority of one level or another. I think that would be my concluding words.
Thank you. I think that's what I'm taking from this conversation also, that being attentive and doing one service and also reading attentively. And from that, the nourishment, the higher taste, what we're actually looking for will naturally come. Thank you so much.
Jai, no worries. Thank you.
Thank you. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.
Jai. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.